The more you read A Song of Ice and Fire, the more you notice certain patterns that George R. R. Martin falls into with his work, be it elaborate food or outfit descriptions, certain passages of thought or dialogue being repeated over a point of view character's chapters, or over multiple point of view characters' chapters, or the topic of this video, houses that tend to, more often than not, be on the wrong side of history. Martin has a sort of Planet of the Hats type mentality with certain houses, as they tend to be the villains more often than not. Houses like House Lannister, House Bolton, House Frey, House Bracken tend to be evil more often than not. However, there is one house that has tended to lurk in the background of modern Westerosi stories that ends up being evil far more often than even any of the houses that I've listed already. This house has been on the wrong side of pretty much every conflict in the history of Westeros, and it seems as though they will do the same in the main story, despite the fact that they haven't appeared very much up until the present moment. So, today, join me as I take a deep dive into the history of House Peake, one of the most evil houses in Westeros. Before we take a glance at the historical records of this house, let's take a peek. You see what I did there? At House Peake as of the end of the 3rd century in the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire. We know that Lord Titus is married to one Lady Margot Lannister, so they are somewhat powerful in the main story, and he is currently the Lord of Starpike, the Peake's castle. But we also know of 3 other Peakes who seem as though they might have a more direct influence on the story. Laswell, Tormund, and Pikewood Peake are all exiles in the Golden Company in support of Aegon Targaryen and his claim to regain the throne of Westeros. The Company has a tendency to pick up knights who have been discarded from Westeros for fighting on the losing side of a conflict, which it seems as though Peake has done many, many, many times. We'll get to the specific conflict for which these 3 were likely exiled in the near future of this video, but it seems as though they will have something to do with Aegon's conflict in Westeros, and they might have some larger role to play, which I will get to. House Peak rule over a portion of the Reach, and they can claim a First Men origin from a very ancient and storied bloodline. Specifically, they claim descent from Floris the Fox, who is the daughter of Garth Greenhand. Both Floris and Garth end up being these historical figures in the Reach, from which a lot of these noble houses claim descent. 3 houses specifically claim descent from Floris the Fox, those being the Peaks, the Florents, and the Balls, and I'm not making that last house up. The Florents are notable in the main story for having the wife of Stannis Baratheon, Selyse Florent, be a member of their house, and the Balls are pretty significant in the Blackfyre Rebellions. So overall, these 3 houses do each kind of make a name for themselves in terms of just smaller reach houses. House Peak started off early in terms of being on the wrong side of history, as even prior to Targaryen conquest of Westeros, they were already rivals with an incredibly popular house. House Manderley, before they ruled in the north, were rulers of a portion of the Reach, specifically around the Mander River. House Peak really, really hated the Manderleys, and they vied for influence in the Reach for what seems like thousands of years, based on the historical records. This, of course, ended with the Manderleys being exiled from the Reach by the Gardeners, the ruling house. They then ended up in the north, where they established themselves as another noble house, ruling over White Harbor, perhaps the most influential port in the north. So it ended up pretty well for them. However, the Peaks exiling one of the most popular houses in the fan community has not gotten them any good points in terms of A Song of Ice and Fire fans. Arriving now at the early Targaryen era, Lord Armand Peake and several of his sons perished during the Field of Fire, one of the most well known battles from Aegon and his sister's conquest of Westeros. The Peaks in general suffer quite a bit because of Targaryen conquest, as they lose a lot of station in the Reach. With the downfall of House Gardener, the former overlords of the Reach, the Peaks lose a blood connection to this ruling house over their larger lands, whereas House Tyrell has no such blood connections to the Peaks, so are far less likely to favor them in any disputes they would have. Lord Uther Peake ruled during the reign of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen and ended up marrying one of Queen Alysanne's companions, one Lady Pernilla Celtigar. This is worth noting because it means that the Peaks have at least some drop of Valyrian blood in their veins, as the Celtigars are a smaller Valyrian house who has a Valyrian steel weapon that is a battle axe that is just awesome, and I wish I could talk about it more. Additionally, during the Great Council of 101, Lord Peake voted for Prince Viserys Targaryen, which is another probably bad call on the Peake's count. This next section is going to cover the Dance of the Dragon, so I advise you skip ahead to the next section if you're going to want to remain unspoiled on House of the Dragon and all of its future developments. That being said, Lord Unwin Peake ends up as a massive Green supporter during the dance, as well as having one of my favorite names in A Song of Ice and Fire history. He has a massive part to play in the Western campaign of this conflict, as he marches alongside Lord Hightower and Daeron Targaryen for the majority of the war, and has a massive role in both battles at Templeton late in the war. He is a member of the Caltrips, and ends up leading the retreat of this army after the death of Lord Hightower and Daemon. Overall, he has a massive role to play in the late game of this war, specifically after becoming one of the regents of King Aegon III Targaryen. If you think what Otto Hightower gets up to as Hand of the King is impressive in terms of what he's able to accomplish in a short amount of time, you have not seen the accomplishments of Unwin Peake. Unwin is at first one of several regents of Aegon III. However, after the death of several key regents, he seizes power for himself. He becomes Hand of the King and begins making an utterly insane amount of appointments to the royal court of all of his family members and friends. Specifically, to list them, he gives white cloaks of the Kingsguard to two members of his family, specifically a nephew and a bastard half brother. He names the former Master of Arms at Starpike the Master of Arms at the Red Keep. He appoints a friend of his from the Caltrips as commander of the City Watch. He also appoints his widowed aunt as a member of the Queen's household. He appoints Lord George Graceford and Victor Risley to other Caltrips to the offices of Lord Confessor and the King's Justice, so two very important justice system appointments in King's Landing. And additionally, he has the very storied Septon Eustace dismissed and replaced with Septon Bernard, who is descended from House Peake. Additionally, he makes his own personal guard, known as the Fingers, and has his uncle, Sir Gedmund Peake, put in charge of the royal fleet and sent to put down pirates in the Stepstones. So overall, a ridiculous amount of peaks in power in King's Landing as of the year 133 AC. This is not the end of Lord Unwin Peake's massive ambition, as some believe that he plots to have the Queen killed during this era, and this very much makes sense, as he seems to, immediately after her death, begin advancing his own daughter as a potential candidate for Queen. That is the action that gets most of the Lords of Westeros to kind of turn against him, as this small house in the Reach has very much up-jumped their station and is grasping at power that they really have no claim to. This ends up getting squashed by other claimants, which I'm not going to get into in case some people still don't want to get everything spoiled from House of the Dragon. But overall, the peaks after this era end up declining from power pretty quickly, despite the fact that they had claimed so much of it in such a short era around 133 AC. Another impressive accomplishment by Unwin Peake during the Dance of the Dragons that I don't think is as much of a spoiler for House of the Dragon, which is why I'm leaving it out of the spoiler section, is stealing a Valyrian steel sword. He ends up taking Orphan-Maker, which is a very edgy sword name, from House Roxton, and it ends up in the possession of House Peake as of some point during the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons, as he's said to have it in 133 AC. It's also speculated that they might have had it during the Blackfyre Rebellions, and that it might have gone into exile with them in Essos. We now arrive at the next series of conflicts in Westerosi history, the Blackfyre Rebellions, during which time the Lord of House Peake was one Lord Gormund Peake. He was known as one of the finest knights in the realm, and he was a steadfast supporter of Daemon the First Blackfyre. He survived the first Blackfyre Rebellion, which is quite impressive given the number of casualties at the Battle of the Red Grass Field. We actually meet him on page during the second Duncan Egg novella, where we see him plotting to install Daemon the Second Blackfyre as a new king of Westeros during the very short-lived Second Blackfyre Rebellion. Unfortunately, this does not go very well for him, and the Peaks end up losing a fair amount of power during the Blackfyre Rebellions. In order to discern exactly what the Peaks lost, we need to take a look at their sigil. You may have noticed that it is three black castles on an orange field, and this represents their initial holdings back when they were first founded. They're initially larger lords. They had three castles to call their own. They had Starpike, Dunstanbury, and Whitegrove. However, after the Blackfyre rebellions and taking the wrong side in one too many conflicts, House Targaryen strips several of their titles from them and takes lands, as many ruling houses do if you take the wrong side in a conflict in Westeros. Specifically, they lose Dunstanbury and Whitegrove, and are left with only their castle of Starpike. The main reason that I think the Peaks are so accomplished in their general assholery is the fact that they are the only noble house of Westeros that we know of directly who has killed a Targaryen king and still exists. The Peaks rose up against the Iron Throne in their own rebellion, this tiny house from the Reach, in the year 233 AC, 100 years after Unwin, probably celebrating his anniversary. King Maekar the First Targaryen specifically and directly went himself to quash this conflict, along with several household knights and members of the Kingsguard. However, he is crushed by a rock hurled from the battlements of Starpike, the castle of the Peaks. He is flattened and ends up being killed by this, and it plunges the realm into a massive succession crisis, as there is no clear and apparent heir for a second after his death. This also ends up killing Lord Robert Rain and Tywald Lannister, so two other High Lords are killed by the Peaks during this rebellion, making them one of the most prolific smaller houses in terms of killing larger lords. What ends up surprising me the most about this entire circumstance is the fact that House Peak still survives. They are still around in Westeros today. They live in Starpike still, and still seem to have the same holdings, despite the fact that they killed all of these High Lords. Roger Rain ends up killing 7 captive Peaks after this, but that's put a stop. Excuse me. That is stopped by Aegon Targaryen V, who is a famously merciful king. So overall, the Peaks end up taking very, very little losses from a rebellion that cost the crown and Westeros as a whole several important lords and kings. House Peak may have been responsible for the death of one Targaryen king, but they are currently attempting to raise up a new one, or at least a new claimant. It seems as though Laswell, Tormund, and Pikewood Peak are all trying to raise up Aegon Targaryen, or potentially Aegon Blackfyre, working to aid the vision of their ancestor Gorman Peak, who tried to put 2 previous Blackfyres on the throne. This would make sense with their motivation as a house, and we hear that they are pretty steadfast supporters of this cause. As in the Griffin Reborn chapter of A Dance with Dragons, we hear that Laswell Peak is sent to capture Rain House, and specifically that he is successful. That's a piece of land in the Stormlands, I believe. And what's more, given the fact that this house did have possession of Orphan-Maker, and we haven't heard of it in a long time, it could make sense that they have possession of this ancient Valyrian steel sword, potentially being another powerful artifact in the possession of the Aegon cause, and lending more legitimacy and strength at arms to this new king's progression towards his crown. This has been the history of House Peak. What do you think of this ancient and storied house? Do you think that's the worst house in Westeros? Do you think other houses have done worse? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'll have another video coming this Sunday. I had a lot of free time this week, so I decided to make an extra video because I felt like talking about the greatest, the peak, the best house ever. And I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did. Really helps me grow the channel, and I will see you all very, very soon for a video this Sunday. Like I said, I will talk to you all in the near future.